Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. My name is Vasilios Marinis. I'm professor of Christian art and architecture here at Yale, and it is my great pleasure to welcome you all, our virtual audience, to this lecture. I will introduce the speakers and the respondents now, The archaeologist Elisabeth Rathmayr is affiliated with the Austrian Archaeological Institute. Her research focuses on ancient Wohnbauforschung, including the use of spaces based on architecture, wall and floor furnishings, sculpture, and all other kind of findings, especially inscriptions. She also studies sculptural decorations of public and private buildings, as well as ancient religion, both pagan and Christian. Veronika Scheibelreiter-Gail is an archaeologist and epigraphist affiliated with the Austrian Archaeological Institute as well. She works for the Supplementum Epigraphicum Graecum and does research in the fields of ancient art history with a focus on mosaics, Wohnbauforschung, and inscriptions. Her main interests lie in the context of inscriptions from dwellings or funerary spaces, mainly in the Greek East. Dr. Rathmayr and Dr. Scheibelreiter-Gail are co-directing a major project titled the Archäologische Kontext von Inschriften im privaten Bereich in the Austrian Academy of Sciences. And the first publication out of this collaboration, concentrating on Greece and the Balkans, will be published in just a few weeks. Our respondent today is Anna Sitz, who is an archaeologist by training and is currently a postdoc at the University of Heidelberg in Germany. Her research is focused on the Eastern Mediterranean and spans from late antiquity into the Byzantine period. She is particularly interested in combining epigraphy with material culture theory. Her monograph, Pagan Inscriptions, Christian Viewers, The Afterlives of Temples and Their Texts in Late Antique Eastern Mediterranean, will be published next month by Oxford University Press. Now I turn the screen to our two speakers.
Okay, so I hope everybody can hear us. Dear colleagues, thank you very much for inviting us to your lecture series. It would have been, of course, a great pleasure to come to Yale in real, to such a famous university. But nonetheless, we are very grateful that you gave us the opportunity to share our ideas with you tonight. So tonight, at least for us. The donor and his house. The idea for this lecture arose during the study of inscriptions from ancient residences, which Elisabeth Rathmayr and I have been collecting during a research project for 7 years now. In 3 research projects, we dedicate ourselves to dwellings and residences of the middle and upper classes of the entire Greek East. On the slide, you can see a map of the regions we cover, which we have divided geographically for 3 monographs as follows. First, Greece and the Greek-speaking Balkans. Second, Turkey and Cyprus. Third, Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, Israel, Egypt, and the Cyrenaica. We work on inscriptions of all kinds that come from dwellings and can be related to the inhabitants. An important group among them are inscriptions in which heads of households and their relatives are named. If these are also known from other sources, the possibility of understanding and interpreting the inscriptions and the furnishings of the dwellings increases. There are numerous studies on ancient benefactors and the endowment system. Despite different legal bases and modalities in individual cases, all ancient foundations had in common the aspect that an individual provided financial means for the benefit of the public. An essential aspect of this is the voluntary nature with which this took place, in contrast to the obligatory payments and labor contributions imposed on citizens and residents of a community. Donations of money and goods, such as the distribution of oil, food, and public meals, as well as the organization of events for public entertainment, such as gladiatorial combats, venationes, chariot races, and the construction, furnishing, and repair of buildings, such as baths, gymnasia, theaters, temples, porticos, and the like, are accordingly to be regarded as benefactions. That is, regardless of whether they were one-time donations or monetary contributions intended for repetition. In modern everyday usage, the term donation encompasses a broad spectrum of meanings. This does more justice to the ancient phenomenon we wish to address here than the use of the term in the strict legal sense. It is not always possible to decide on the basis of the sources whether an endowment in the proper sense, namely funds given by the founder for a specified purpose, the interest income from which is to be repeatedly used for a specified purpose at specified intervals, was included, or whether it was a one-time financial donation. We therefore understand endowment here as a transfer of assets subject to conditions. Inscriptions that provide information about this are also referred to as donor inscriptions. Donor personalities are mostly perceived as persons in the public sphere and are also discussed as such by scholars. This begins with the classical and Hellenistic aiargetai and ktistai and extends to the late antique benefactors who, like their Hellenistic and imperial predecessors, made temporary and permanent grants to communities, often including buildings such as aqueducts, nymphaea, and bath gymnasia. Especially from Constantine on, foundations in the area of the church emerged as a large new field of activity, following the emperor's example. Testimonies are recorded in pictures and words. What has not been done so far, but we want to present in our lecture, is whether and how archaeological and epigraphic findings from residences of the upper classes can be linked to founder personalities. For it can be assumed that the elites within a community, members of the local and later primarily the imperial aristocracy, inhabited sumptuous residences. We asked ourselves what traces they left behind in these areas and whether public patronage was also reflected here. Let us have a look on the architecture of the upper class dwellings in the Greek East. From the late classical period onwards, they were multi-storied peristyle houses. Rooms with different functions were accessed from central courtyards, surrounded by columns and accompanied by halls. From the 2nd century AD onwards, many of the large residences were equipped with apsidal halls that served for the reception of guests. Multi-roomed bath suites that were visited together with the guests before the banquets were also common in these residences. Apart from the service areas as kitchens and storerooms, peristyle and living spaces were furnished with mosaics and opposectile floors. Their walls were painted, stuccoed, or covered with colorful marble slabs. Bearing this in mind, we will deal with the residences and the personalities of the benefactors known by name that we came across during our research. These will be presented in chronological order. In a Hellenistic residence of average size and furnishings on the Cycladic island of Delos, a woman named Cleopatra honored her husband Dioscurides with 2 portrait statues on an inscribed base. Opposite the entrance. The statue niche could be closed by 2 barrier panels that made them appear as if in a shrine. The honorific monument here includes not only the statue of the honored, but also that of his wife Cleopatra. This is an outstanding example for which we have no other evidence. We learn that Dioscurides had dedicated 2 silver tripods to the temple of Apollo, certainly the one at Delos. In the inscription, his dedication is referred to immediately before the mention of the Athenian archontate, which allows a dating of the inscription into 138 BC. We do not know if the tripods were the only donation by Dioscurides during his lifetime. Perhaps they were mentioned because they showed Dioscurides as a man involved in the religious life of the polis. His gift may have been referred to in another inscription that was erected in the local sanctuary of Artemis. There, Dioscurides and his daughters Aniche and Theodote were honored by the Athenian demos, not only with laurel and ivy wreaths, but explicitly with the right to set up a consecration, because they had hosted crews of the Athenian fleet at Delos. This consecration gift could have been the silver tripods that are mentioned in an inscription in Cleopatra's house. By referring to it, Cleopatra established a link between the public and the private sphere of her town. It is probable that her husband was already dead when she had the honorific statues erected in her house. By this, she was able to underline her position in the polis and in her dwelling. Let us switch to the imperial period now, and first to Asia Minor. In Ephesus, the Roman knight Gaius Vibius Salutaris made a foundation in the times of Emperor Trajan. The inscription referring to it was engraved on marble slabs, which, according to the text, were to be published on the southern parados wall of the Great Theatre and in a suitable place of the Artemision. Of these, the inscription in the theatre has been largely preserved. We can assume that the placement was chosen by the donor himself, since along the parados wall, the dignitaries and officials walked to their seats in the cavea. The inscription was not so much a document that should be consulted in case of disputes or ambiguities concerning the endowment, but rather a perpetual public honoration of Gaius Vibius Salutaris. The text stated, among other things, that 31 statuettes of Phyles, gods and heroes, among them several statuettes of the Artemis of Ephesus, as well as of personifications of the Roman Senate and the demos, had to be carried in a solemn procession from the sanctuary of Artemis to the Great Theatre in the city center and back again, at popular assemblies, at all athletic competitions and other events. In the theatre, the statuettes were placed on 9 bases that each bore the name and curriculum of Salutaris himself. On the slide, you can see the route that the procession took through Ephesus. It passed by a house that highly probably was the municipal residence of the donor. I'll come to that in a moment. In the elaborate inscription from the theatre, it is stated that statuettes or busts of the Emperor Trajan and his wife Plotina had to be kept and worshipped in Salutaris' house. Moreover, in his dwelling, the payoff for a lottery to the Neokoroi and the former Asiaches took place, the winners of which had to sacrifice to Artemis. It must have been a real spectacle in the house, with lots of people attending. In one of the dwelling units of Terrace House 2 in Ephesus, the name Salutaris is preserved in graffiti that can be taken as hints to the owner of the house. In addition, the ivory frieze of a piece of furniture was found, on which Trajan, with whom Salutaris had a special relationship, is depicted. It is widely accepted that dwelling unit 2 of the Terrace House 2 in the late 1st and early 2nd century AD was the residence of Gaius Vibius Salutaris, who was a prominent member of the municipal elite. He staged his person in several ways. On the one hand, by the splendor and number, as well as the silver and gold value of the statuettes that were carried in the procession through the city. On the other hand, through the 9 stone bases erected in the theatre, which bore his name and his curriculum, as well as the large inscription on the marble slabs at the entrance to the theatre. He also emphasized the foundation by his personal appearance in the theatre, where he sat, according to the inscription, among the Bouleutai, crowned with a golden wreath. At his home, in addition, he organized the big payoff of the lottery. Salutaris knew how to put his accomplishments in the right light, not only by giving money and erecting monuments, but also through his personal performance. By this, he established a link between residence and polis, as explicitly stated in the inscription. In this way, he of course increased his social status. Another benefactor, which is illustrative for our topic, is the sophist Titus Flavius Damianus of Ephesus. His life, but especially his way of life, is known to us from the Vitae Sophistarum of Flavius Philostratos, written in 242 or 243 AD. Philostratos described the activities of individuals from the urban elites of Asia Minor. They held civil and sacred offices and were characterized by unusually great economic, social, and political influence. Special positions and honors by the cities were compensated in return by endowments and charities of all kinds, from the construction of public buildings to monetary payments, donations in kind, and the financing of agones and other events. In the case of Damianus, however, we are in the fortunate position of also having epigraphic sources and archaeological evidence that provide a picture of his activities as a benefactor in the city as well as his residences. We learn about the donations of Damianus from inscriptions and from the literary evidence. They describe grain distributions from his own money, the financing of the quartering of the troops on their return from the Parthian campaign in 166 AD, as well as the construction of an oikos with magnificent furnishings in the so-called Baths of Varius. Further, a stoa between the Artemis sanctuary and the city, which protected visitors and processions to the sanctuary from wind and weather. Moreover, a banqueting house in the sanctuary itself. Damianus had also the palaestra of the East Gymnasium built, where statues of himself and his wife Vedia Fedrina were placed in the so-called Emperor's Hall. But what do we know about Damianus's residences? Philostratos delivers that the sophist owned several estates in the suburbs of Ephesus. They not only served his private comfort and display of luxury. By growing fruit on his estates and establishing a protected harbor, he also provided for the common good. At the age of 70, Damianus died in Ephesus and was buried in his favorite villa, where he had spent most of his lifetime. A circular building preserved in the southeast outside Ephesus can be identified as the tomb of Damianus and his wife Vedia Fedrina by the fragments of a metrical inscription. As the funerary space today is in a very bad condition and surrounded by an agricultural area, unfortunately not much more is known about his villa, apart from a late antique mosaic of a following building and a part of a cryptoporticus discovered by chance some years ago. In the course of our project about inscriptions in their archaeological context, in Patras in Greece, we came across a mosaic floor uncovered on the western slope of the Acropolis. The panel with its inscription is now kept in the Archaeological Museum of the town. From the inscription, it becomes clear that the mosaic floor that has not further been preserved was set for the municipal official Isleios Nikostratos by his son Isleios Nikostratos. It is roughly dated to the 2nd century AD. Since the find spot is overbuilt by modern Patras, the further spatial context of the mosaic is unfortunately not known. While the present pavement was created by the son literally as a monument to the father, confer the last two lines, it cannot be the one mentioned in the inscription itself. There it is stated that the father built a triclinium, that is a reception room, and had it adorned with mosaic. The father Nicostratos Senior was a public figure in the Colonia Augusta Achaica Patrensis, as evident from the offices he held. The triclinium he had built could have been at the disposal of a larger public, perhaps an association. It is tempting to mention here a second mosaic with inscription from Patras, which a certain Doros had laid with his own means on the occasion of the takeover of the Grammateia. He also built a triclinium. The beneficiaries were the so-called Statianitai named in the inscription. They were tentatively identified with an association whose members were dedicated to the production or distribution of wine, namely the Statanos Oinos from Italy. Both men, Isleos Neikostratos, but also the man ending on whose name was ending on Doros, were Grammateis from Patras, who donated triclinia with the mosaic furnishings from their own money. Only in the first case, the one of Neikostratos, it can be assumed that the inscription of the floor was laid afterwards in his own residence by his son. It is, though, conceivable that patrons of mosaic floors and buildings dedicated to associations had them sometimes laid in their own estates or residences. An inscription on a mosaic floor from Smyrna, probably from the 3rd century AD, sheds light on such a situation, though similarly out of architectural context as the previous two. It was found in a vineyard in Bornova at the beginning of the 20th century. The excavators described a mosaic floor with vines and a lion, which we have not seen yet. Due to their testimony, the inscription was originally placed in a tabula ansata, immediately in front of a rectangular recessed area in the mosaic, where probably an altar or statue base for Dionysus was situated. Tiberius Julius Julianus, citizen of Smyrna, had the mosaic laid in a Pakreion. Again, an official, a member of the Boule, appears as a benefactor of an association that had to do with wine. That the sanctuary or the meeting place of the Bacchus Society was located on his estate becomes evident here from the phrase despotes duc temados. The despoteia denotes the power of disposal that someone has over another person or over a thing. Despotes is a legal term, denotes the owner of a house or land. The inscription thus states that Julianus, the lord of the estate, had a mosaic floor laid for the Bakreion. By mentioning his functions, he was Puleutes, Periodonices, and Xystarches. He presented himself to a public that consisted at least of the members of the Bacchus Society. What we do not know for sure is whether Julianus had a residence on the property itself. However, the fact that residential houses were also used by associations for their meetings is known from other inscriptions and also from archaeological findings. A case where the donation to a religious association, this time the Jewish community, was related to the donor's residence, is found in the center of ancient Stobi in nowadays northern Macedonia. On the slide, you can see the map of the ancient city and the ruins of the so-called House of Polycharmos. According to the testimony of a long inscription engraved into a column, a certain Claudius Tiberius Polycharmos, most probably at the end of the 2nd century AD, placed the ground floor of his residential building. There is talk of a triclinium and a tetrastoon, that is a peristyle courtyard, at the disposal of the local Jews for use as a synagogue. In the text, Polycharmos expressly stated that he would continue to live on the upper floor, that is, above the synagogue, and also retain ownership of it. This was also to extend to his heirs. He moreover said that he and his heirs would repair the roof. That means that they would take care of the maintenance of the building. Due to the destruction of the synagogue during the construction of a church, hardly anything of the Polycharmos building has remained. It can be assumed, though, that it was a multi-story peristyle house. The oldest synagogue, established on the ground floor of the house, can be assigned the column with the donor inscription. It presumably stood in the peristyle court or on the side of the entrance, as well as plaster fragments and a marble slab with painted inscriptions. The Dipinti mention the fulfillment of a vow made by Polycharmos, which probably involved leaving the ground floor of his house to the Jews. The donor's epithet, pater, indicates his position in the Jewish community, which may have led to the donation of a part of his house to them. Another donor personality in Stoby, this time from the second half of the 5th or early 6th century AD, was a woman named Peristeria, who donated a part of the mosaic floor in the southern aisle of the Episcopal Church. The name Peristeria also occurs in a residential building in the center of the city, where it is laid in black tesserae into 2 fields of the mosaic floor of an apsidal hall. At least 12 people were mentioned in them. They were probably responsible for the design and actual laying of the pavement, perhaps also for the decoration of the hall. As the building is a residence, the inhabitants and people close to them can be recognized in them. Elements such as the marble fountain installed in the center of the floor and the figurative depictions, such as the deer on the sides of a kantaros, of which emerges the tree of life on the mosaic floor, point to Christian inhabitants. They could have adapted a space here for religious gatherings, such as a communal meal. Since the name Peristeria is generally rare, it can be assumed that the donor of the mosaic in the bishop's church is identical with the one on the mosaic floor in the dwelling. Moreover, since Peristeria's name is written the first line of the inscription, together with one Rufinus, she can be conceived as the lady of the house and Rufinus as her husband. As was customary in this period, she had donated the church floor or a part of it for her salvation. The identity of being a Christian was also shown in the furnishings of her house, which indicate gatherings of Christians. Let us now again leap back in time. An important field of activity in which benefactors scored points with the public was the organization of events for mass entertainment, gladiatorial combats, animal chases, and chariot races. They were held on certain occasions by emperors, but also by high civil and military dignitaries. The financing of these spectacles required high funds and was thus a duty and privilege of the elite. Representations of these games are often encountered in the domestic imagery to illustrate generosity and charity. In cases where we do not know the names of the house's inhabitants, they clearly point out to their social class. And even if today it cannot be proven with certainty, they are likely to reflect real events, that is, the financing of spectacles by the householders. Games of all sorts occur on mosaic floors of residences in both the eastern and western part of the empire, which is also evidence of their great importance. While the depiction of a venatio in a house in Daphne near Antioch will be discussed later, a well-known example from the western part of the empire shall be presented here. The mosaic floor, dated to the middle of the 3rd century AD, was found in Smirat, near Tystros in present-day Tunisia, and may have decorated a villa. On the tessellate, a certain Magarius is celebrated for holding a venatio by an elaborate inscription in 2 columns and a representation of the venatores fighting leopards. The text seems to reflect the shouts of the audience when it says, "By whom has a show such as this ever been presented? When has a show such as this ever been presented? On the example of the quaestors of Rome, you will present a show. From your pocket you will present a show. This is the day. It is Magarius who is presenting it." The figures and their inscriptions are spread over the floor surface and can be viewed from different sides. Shifted from the center, somewhat to the left, is a servant figure holding with both hands a tray of money bags, each of which is inscribed with 1,000. Around this is a venatio scene with 4 venatores fighting leopards, men and animals bearing name inscriptions. Twice appears the name of Magarius as Mageri, which is to be understood as a vocative, an acclamation to the provider of the game. A larger figure on the slide to be seen on the upper right, upside down, only partially preserved, dressed in a dark red robe, over which is sort of a fur or another protection, is supposed to represent the patron of the mosaic, the presumed master of the house. However, the clothing speaks against it. It is more likely to see in him a victorious venator standing next to the leopard perishing beside him. However, the depictions and the inscription of the mosaic make clear that Magarius was a local greatness and had given a spectacle to his fellow citizens.
Apart from this, many homeowners used images of personifications in their houses, especially on mosaics, to indicate their endowments and benefactions. East of the ancient theater of Argos in Greece, parts of a large residential building, the so-called villa of a falconer, were uncovered. The rooms are arranged around a large peristyle, of which only the courtyard, its western and southern halls, and 3 rooms on the western side are excavated. Of these rooms, one in the center can be called a triclinium, since the mosaic floor defines a stibadium, a place where the couches were arranged in U form. In front of a stibadium used for dining, a Dionysian Thyrsos was depicted on the mosaic. The southern and western halls of the peristyle were decorated with figural mosaic floor with inscriptions. Panel 1, which is strongly damaged, apparently contained a different sujet than the other panels, on which show representations of 2 months. Now, on panel 1, the remains of the letters Enos were previously interpreted as part of an emperor's name placed in some sort of dedicatory panel. With a greater possibility, however, one may assume that here the homeowner was represented in word and perhaps also in an image. The panel opened the cycle of the personifications of the 12 months. All but January refer to month-specific agricultural activities through clothing and attributes. But January instead wears a toga and his face has portrait-like features. He performs the gesture of esparcio by throwing coins from his raised palm onto a salicorullis. Thus, this figure could be understood not only as a personification of January, but also refer to the owner of the house, whose name ended with Enos. He had perhaps held the office of consul, and on taking office had distributed gifts, such as the so-called consular diptychs, and organized games as part of the January calendars. Donors are not so often shown making the gesture of esparcio as one would assume. Whether this is due to the preservation of the ancient sources or has other reasons would still have to be investigated. The pictorial formula of esparcio was invented in the 4th century AD. It occurs firstly in connection with emperors and their environment and was taken over for depictions of upper-class benefactors. It served to illustrate foundations or the possibility of using financial resources for the public benefit. A permanent example, which is to be connected with the whole family of benefactors, comes from the so-called Iacto residence at Daphne near Antioch on the Orontes. Here, representations on the mosaic floor of a large room are provided with inscriptions. In the central emblem is a female bust named Megalopsyche, being the personification of generosity. She's surrounded by hunters killing wild animals, which refer to venationes, special games in the circus. Not only do they illustrate a lavish lifestyle, but according to the central motto, Megalopsyche, they are also meant to point out the enormous costs of these pleasures. As discussed above, these depictions suggest that the homeowner was a person who held a high civil or military office, such as the consulship. He belonged to a class which made endowments and other acts for the general public. Probably one building on the outer framing of the same mosaic, the probably street scenes in Antioch and Daphne are shown, can be referred to a foundation. It is consisting of several rooms with small windows, some of the rooms with domed roofs. It is named to Pribaton Adaburiou, the privately financed bath of Adaburios, and thus represents a donation of his person. Since this name is the only one of the entire mosaic floor that can be associated with a historical person, the Adaburios mentioned was very likely the owner of the residence. Probably it was Adaburios Junior who had held the consulship in 447, the title Patricius at latest in 453, and was present in Antioch as Magister Militum per Orientem from 453 to 466 AD. This interpretation also fits well into the overarching concept of generosity represented by Megalopsyche in the center of the floor. Altogether, only 3 images of Megalopsyche are known to date, 2 of which can be traced back to the same family. One is depicted in the Iacto residence, the other in the Vienna Dioscurides, a Greek manuscript containing texts of the physician Petanios Dioscurides. This book was a present for Anicia Juliana from the inhabitants of Honorate near Constantinople for a church she endowed in that suburb. Anicia Juliana was a famous woman who belonged to the Theodosian family. She had married the grandson of Adaburios Junior, of whom we think that he was the owner of the Iacto residence and the patron of the mosaic there. So the images of Megalopsyche in this residence in the manuscript can be linked to the same family. Both carry a bulging sporta and convey generosity. But while Megalopsyche on the Iacto mosaic tosses coins on behalf of the homeowner, who is not depicted, in the Viennese Dioscurides, the infirm benefactress Anicia Juliana performs this act herself. The third representation of Megalopsyche has been known only recently. It was discovered in 2015 on a mosaic floor of a residence in Antioch. What is striking is that her iconography is totally different from the other 2 images of Megalopsyche. Unlike them, she does not carry a bulging sporta, nor is she throwing coins, but holds a measuring rod in her hand. This is unusual since this rod is a tool of builders and the attribute of ktisis, the personification of erection and foundation, being found on mosaics of residences as well. Since imagery programs of any kind in residential buildings were often meticulously planned by the builders, this cannot be a mistake. Rather, a creative spirit may have combined 2 qualities into one representation. While the measuring rod is to be related to the foundation or construction of a building, Megalopsyche is the condition for it. If our interpretation is correct, however, this Megalopsyche, like the other 2, does not refer to the construction of the residential building in which she is depicted. For this, it was not necessary to mention the generosity of the owner, but to a building dedicated to the general public. Many abstract personifications are attested, especially in Antioch, its suburb Daphne, and the port city Seleucia Pieria, the majority of which date from late antiquity. However, more and more finds in recent years, often in the course of looted excavations, make it clear that they were generally widespread on mosaic floors of southeastern Anatolia and northern Syria. For expressing a founder's activity, especially ctisis, the new construction, new foundation, as well as ananeosis, renewal or renovation, was used. Cosmesis and epicosmesis, on the other hand, symbolized furnishings and decorations. However, these personifications are found not only in residences, but also on the mosaics of churches where they indicate the activity of donors. On the slide, there are mosaics with images of donors with their donations, as well as real donations of a silver cup and a silver bell with the vows of their donors. But let's come back to residences of benefactors, where in addition to the aforementioned megalopsychia, also images of ctisis and ananeosis can be associated with the financing of public buildings. In the so-called Constantinian villa in Daphne, as well as in the house of the sea goddess in Seleucia Pieria, ctisis and ananeosis are combined with dynamis, the ability to carry out something, and oiandria, which is male strength or male decisiveness. The qualities behind these terms are certainly to be related to the homeowners. All these qualities together are necessary to realize a building or foundation project. It is quasi the ideal combination and the basic premise for it. Unfortunately, in both cases, the names of the homeowners are not known, which is why it is not possible to establish a connection with foundations attested from ancient sources. Yet, the differentiation between ctisis and ananeosis in these houses suggests that the homeowners had donated new buildings as well as financed renovations of structures in the public sphere. Only a few inscriptions in residences thematize reconstructions in the houses themselves, as an inscription of the second half of the 3rd century AD in a house in Nicopolis in Greece can show. Here, for the refurbishment of a residence, not a personification of ananeosis was chosen, but the homeowner Antoninus appeared as Ananeotes, the renewer. In connection with the personification of abstract qualities, we wondered when the first appeared. This led us to Herodes Atticus, one of the most important benefactors and philanthropists in the 2nd century AD, whose moral integrity is debated in ancient sources, but whose achievements and benefactions are undisputed. He had several residences in different places, including the villa in Oia on the Peloponnese. This villa, built in the countryside, included several complexes and also involved the surrounding countryside and pre-existing sanctuaries. The different complexes and rooms, respectively, are arranged around a central peristyle surrounded on 4 sides by halls. The whole villa was richly decorated. Many sculptures, but also mosaics, were combined with inscriptions. Some of these texts are long epigrams, surely authored by Herodes himself. But let us now turn to the mosaic floor in the northern hall of the peristyle. Their personification of ctisis is depicted in the form of a female bust with a measuring rod in her hand, which is also her typical attribute in all later examples. Next to ctisis is a mythological image with Dido and Aeneas, whose hairstyles and faces recall Herodes Atticus and his wife Regilla. On the other side of the image, ctisis is opposed to Apolausis. This personification of pleasure or enjoyment is not otherwise found in residences, but is known from public baths, where she can be seen as an invitation to visitors. Now, what messages could Herodes Atticus have conveyed through these personifications? Through ctisis, he could have celebrated himself as a benefactor of the buildings he financed, while through Apolausis, he could have invited to their enjoyment. Among his many foundations are the Odeon in Athens and the Nymphaeum in Olympia, just to give you an idea of what he financed for the public. As in the villa of Herodes Atticus, also in the residence of Eustolios in Cyprus, a personification of thesis can be connected with a homeowner known by name. He too is attested as a founder of public buildings. The bust of Thesis, with a typical attribute of a measuring rod, is depicted on a mosaic floor in one of the bathrooms of a residence. Presumably, it was here to recall a butler bath that the homeowner had built for the people of Curion, as another inscription in the peristyle of the house tells us, by saying that Eustolios did not forget the city of his ancestors, but first presented the baths to our city. That the homeowner was a Christian is evident from another mosaic inscription in the peristyle, where it is written, instead of large stones, instead of solid iron, bright bronze, and instead of adamant, these rooms girded themselves with very venerated signs of Christ. Like many late antique dwellings, the residence of Eustolios may have been protected by Christian symbols, such as crosses or a Christogram. They were preferably placed at house entrances and in peristyle courtyards as a protection against evil coming from the outside. Let's summarize. Among the approximately 350 dwellings that we have investigated so far in Greece, the Balkans, Turkey, and Cyprus, most may have been inhabited by donors, but the endowment activity of them is only very rarely evident from the 1,500 inscriptions and also from the archaeological evidence of the houses. Due to this large number of residential buildings and inscriptions studied, the reason for this cannot be solely their preservation or rather non-preservation. What is certain, however, is that from Hellenistic times to late antiquity, homeowners presented themselves as benefactors in their residences. The inscriptions in which we refer to their foundations and benefactions are located in the peristyle courtyards and in front of and in large reception rooms. These are areas that were frequented by friends, guests, and other visitors during receptions and banquets. To ensure that images and inscriptions could be easily captured, their positioning as well as the sizes and colors of letters had been planned together with the architecture in the course of the construction of the houses or during rebuilding. The ways in which homeowners pointed at the endowments and benefactions in their homes differ. Some addressed them directly. This is the case in Delos, where an honorary inscription on the base of a portrait statue in the honoree's residence commemorated his endowment in a sanctuary. In Stovi, a donor inscription was placed on a column of a residential building whose ground floor the homeowner had given to the Jewish community for the establishment of a synagogue. As is generally the case, a foundation inscription was displayed at the place of the foundation, that is the house of the donor. Another such case is Tiberius Julius Julianus, who had bequeathed a plot of land in Smyrna to a Tunisian association. And something similar can be assumed for the house of Peristera in Stovi. Here, Peristera and her husband probably made a large absidal room of their house available for religious gatherings of Christians. The naming of 12 people on the mosaic floor of this room should perhaps remind of this use. While in these cases the homeowners named their foundations and benefactions in inscriptions, Gaius Vibius Salutaris used his house for acts linked to his foundation. His donor inscription designated his home as a place of worship for the emperor and as a place for the distribution of endowment money. Through this, Salutaris staged himself as a benefactor in his house during certain periodic events. While in the examples just mentioned homeowners directly referred to their foundations and benefactions in their houses. In other cases, they did this only indirectly through certain images. One such motive is the gesture of the spasio, which can be considered a reliable synonym for foundations and benefactions. The throwing of coins from the palm of the hand, sometimes combined with a bulging sporter, was certainly known to everyone and did not need to be explained in detail. The same is true for the depiction of venationes and chariot races. Their message was also clear. The representation of these games conveyed that the homeowners belonged to the upper classes and that their financial means and their functions performed made these games possible in the first place. For contemporaries, we could bring back memories of specific games organized by the homeowners. Yet since we were often part of the imaginary program of the residences over several generations, their significance can also be guessed at for the descendants of the original patrons, who, as members of the upper class, were certainly also benefactors. Next to Vespasio and the pictures of Venationes and chariot races, founders referred to their benefactions by means of personifications of abstract concepts, especially in late antiquity. These were expressed mainly through ctesis and megalopsychia. Ctesis stood for the erection of a building, megalopsychia for generosity, a basic requirement for all kinds of benefactions. Moreover, in some cases, the personification ananeosis is likely to refer to foundations that involve the renovation of public buildings. Individuals who thematized the endowments and benefactions and inscription on images in their residences directly linked the public sphere to their houses. While everything outside of the residences required the approval of local institutions and sometimes even from the emperor, in their residences, they were more or less free to decide how they wanted to present themselves and their families. Perhaps the hesitation to address and above all directly name foundations in one's own house has to do with the fact that this would have put one too much in competition with the emperor. Even in the free residences of Herodes Atticus, who donated a large number of buildings in Greece and Asia Minor for the general public and had married a woman who was related to the imperial house, there is no direct reference to his foundations in them. Only the images of Ctesis and Apollousis on the mosaic floor in the villa at Oya, however, are likely to refer to these foundations, but in a very general way. That donors hesitated to refer to their benefactions in words and pictures in their own homes is also shown in the use of a gesture of Vespasio, which was a synonym for generosity since Constantine the Great. It was only once associated with a real person, namely on a small mosaic image in a church of the later 6th century AD, far away from the center of power. Just as through the personifications of megalopsychia, ctesis, and ananeosis, which without depicting the donors themselves are to be regarded as the representatives, the gesture of Vespasio outside the imperial family was associated with personifications rather than real persons. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Elisabeth and Veronika. As I am the respondent for the paper, I will start right in. So thank you very much for this extremely rich presentation with so much material. And I have to say, most of it is new to me. So I have more questions than comments about this material. But you've very convincingly shown us the great variety of connections between benefactions and benefactors and private houses, as well as some of the occasional continuities going all the way back to the Hellenistic period with this quite remarkable, I think, house of Cleopatra with the statue and dedication to her husband. And then moving all the way forward into the Roman period and into late antiquity. And you've also shown us the connections here between the epigraphic material and the images, the mosaics, which really play a major role in signaling this donation activity or signaling the characteristics of the house owner, alluding to these donations, even if there's not explicit statements that he donated something or she donated something outside the house. So it's really nice to see the mosaic evidence, the figural evidence brought into connection with the inscriptions and with this larger tradition of benefactions recorded or alluded to inside private houses. And so also in line with other scholarship on domestic space for example, in the Latin West by Andrew Wallace Hadrill, for example. You've demonstrated that our modern ideas of public and private space don't really work for antiquity or for late antiquity. In fact, much of what went on in the private houses of these elites was intended for public viewing and for public discussion, perhaps. And you show that very nicely with the example from Ephesus of Salutaris's house and his dedication recorded on the cedar, stating that there's going to be a procession which passes by what was most likely his house. So that shows very nicely the connection between these private spaces and public activities as well. And of course, it would be expected that members of the public would come into these houses and would see these inscriptions and mosaics. And yet, as you've also shown us, these benefactors only rarely explicitly referred to their benefactions within their own private houses. So we do seem to have some expectation of what is appropriate perhaps in different spaces or what makes sense in different spaces. Maybe we can talk about why there's this distinction between what is shown in the houses and what is shown in public later. But coming back to the great variety that you have shown to us, I can also mention the personifications. And as you make here clear, these personifications, for example, at the house of Eustolius on Cyprus at Kourion, were much more than simply decoration, as some previous scholars might perhaps think of them as simply, oh, these decorate the houses. But in fact, they're closely related with the owner or the donor in these cases. And moreover, they're not simply isolated images on the floors or in mosaic fields, but they're also involved in these larger performances of benefactions, of throwing money, for example, or of building structures, as shown with these catesis figures, etc. As we also saw in the Antioch example. And I was particularly taken by this Tunisian mosaic showing the Venazione scene and the having then the words, what seems to be what the crowd itself was shouting to honor and to acclaim the house owner. I think that's really, really remarkable. And that also points out that this is not only words and images, but also orality at play here, with the voicing of these texts, reading them out loud, and at least presenting the idea that this is really what was said on a specific occasion, or what should be said perhaps on a specific occasion. So that was also very, very nice. Yes. And I also was very interested in the example of the synagogue at Stowe, where we had a donation inscription that seemed to me a little bit different than the other examples, and I will ask you to comment on this. This was the donation inscription of Polycarmos, who states that he will continue to live on the upper floor and to own upstairs, and that he will even maintain the roof. So you've mentioned that you're not talking about endowments in the legal sense or the juridical sense, but in this particular text, differently than the other ones, he seems to be making, I don't know, a kind of clear distinction about his own responsibilities versus what the community now is in control of or has charge of, etc. Do you think this text is working differently than some of the other ones? And also just in terms of its materiality, how it looks, it seemed a little bit more, perhaps less decorative than some of the other texts that we've seen. Can you comment on this synagogue inscription from Stowe?
Yeah, we'll try to find it again. Can you just manage? Oh yeah, let's go back to it. Yes, of course, you're right. This is a very outstanding example. It's really not decorative inscription, of course, and it's really a very elaborate text, as I showed you. And it has been very much debated since I think it was founded in the 1930s. Yes. by various scholars, and there are so many translations and comments on each legal term here also, which I must say I'm not the competent person to make ancient law. I think we have a center here in Vienna and everywhere else, but I'm not the person that can maybe answer what you want to hear from me. But what I found very interesting, and we talked about this inscription in a Stowe conference some years ago, and I think it was accepted, our idea, because we were mainly interested, of course, in the building itself, which we showed where there's really nothing of it anymore, of the synagogue, and because it was overbuilt by a church, and there were two synagogues, two faces, and then there was the church. But it's so interesting, the text that Claudius Tiberius Polychamus states that he has the exousia and the despoteia. So there's about different parts of the house. So I highlighted it also, and you see it, he has the authority about the over all the upper rooms and the ownership, and he makes very clear. And so it's really like a legal document, or a really donation document, of course. Yeah, it's not only just to show what he has done, of course. And when you see what's very interesting is also his the fine. He says, whoever wants to make a change against my decision shall pay 250,000 denarii, what is immense sum of money. Yeah, and it has, of course, also been debated about if this is a real sum, or should it just deter so much that the people won't do anything against his decision. So, of course, this donor inscription has many aspects that could be discussed longer, and it was and what we think okay,
I think it's also maybe different from the other inscriptions we looked at, because this inscription was placed in the place of the donation itself, because the ground floor is the donation. We know all the public buildings where we find the donation inscriptions on these buildings, like on temples, nymphia, baths, etc. This was on the place there. This was put at the place where Polychamus made his donation. What is really striking is that he still lived in the upper floor, but maybe as pater with function, he worked at the place where he lived. So
yes, very practical. Yes. Yes. Yes, no, this is a very interesting inscription, because it seems almost to mix genres. So I'm thinking here of the very large finds on some gravestones, also from the Eastern Mediterranean, in which incredibly huge fines are named, which probably nobody could ever actually pay, or would ever actually pay. Yeah, so it's sort of this performative, putting a huge amount just so that everybody knows you're serious about it. Which I think is very interesting. And also here, I wonder if we perhaps are seeing an inscribed copy of perhaps an actual document, an official document, a legal document on papyrus, which has now been inscribed. Whereas in many other cases, it seems that it's not, it's more of a showing off inscription rather than a here's all of the actual content of what we are going to do. Yeah, that's very interesting. And perhaps a related question, going on this idea of he's also living in this place. I noticed that in one of the inscriptions, the one from Patras by so-and-so Doros, I don't know what the first part of his name is. Doros. Yeah. Yes. Let's see if we find it. Yes.
Patras is weiter oben.
Das war am Anfang. Geht's zu Druck? Ach so, sorry. Wrong direction. Okay.
No problem.
Warum gibt's nichts weiter? Now it's doing this. So.
This one?
Not the next one, I think, or?
This one?
Oh,
yes, this one. Yes, exactly. Yes. Well, in fact, looking at the two of them, the one from the son to his father, and then this one is very interesting, because it explicitly states that he has built something from his own funds, which of course is an extremely common phrase in all kinds of donations in public spaces. But I'm just wondering, do you know of any examples where the inscription is definitely in a private house, but also uses this phrase "from his own funds," because it seems kind of unnecessary if you're the owner of a place.
Yeah, in the house.
State that you're using your own funds. It seems a little bit redundant or unnecessary to state that. Do you have any examples in which you have somebody in their own house saying, "I have actually done this from my own funds"?
To be true, we showed you all our examples. So there's nothing more, the evidence we have the overview of. No, that's very outstanding indeed. And we must say it's our assumption. It could be that it was in a private house. We don't know it for sure, but you can see on the right side, we only have the mosaic floor and the part of it that is now in the Museum of Patras. It has never been published elaborately. And it's just, so we don't know much about its context. We only can guess from the place where it was found that it was a little, not really outside the town, but in a remote area. So we don't know. And yeah, I think most people, the Greek archaeologists guessed that it's like a Villa Rustica, and shown here the people making wine. But of course, it could only be just a symbolic meaning for this Statyanitae society. Yeah, so we're not completely sure, but Elisabeth can mention something.
Maybe you can compare. We have a few inscriptions, which are surely from dwellings, in which office is named, which you usually find not in houses, but in official inscriptions in the public. So this is not an indication that it was not a dwelling, you know. So you have to think, and maybe with our third project, we find an inscription where you'll also find this formula, but only because you have a formula until now only in the public or in sanctuaries, it's not excluding that this could not come from a house.
Yes, absolutely.
Good, and
yes.
it's what you, to take up the point you mentioned before, it's actually very interesting. You said private and public, you know, this old discussion between these spheres, different spheres of the town. So maybe, yeah, it was open to a broader public, or we can imagine nowadays. So, but still, yeah, it gives room for discussion, of course. The Patras example. Yeah.
Yes, and I'm very, very much looking forward to your third project to get the full picture of the Eastern Mediterranean on this. Yes. Yes. And now I'll ask a question related to some of your other publications. Actually, I think a publication by Veronika, in which you talk about the reduced opportunities for commemoration in public spaces in late antiquity, where public spaces become more dominated by imperial figures or people in the imperial bureaucracy. And I think you even bring up the term interiorization. So bringing up the term used by Maria Fabricius Hansen to talk about the focus on the interiors of churches, which I liked that comparison. I found that really interesting. And I'm just wondering, because I'm also thinking here about, on the one hand, there's a desire not to compete with imperial figures or imperial statues in public spaces, and perhaps not being allowed even to do that. But also thinking in terms of James Osborne's fairly recent article about when you put a monument in a public space, you're in fact opening it up to criticism, to, for example, damnatio memoriae, or to being pulled down by an angry mob at some point. And he calls this counter monumentality. So I'm wondering if you also think that part of the motivations here might be the idea that the house owner, if he or she keeps their commemoration on the interior of their house, whether through personifications and images or through inscriptions, in some way they're maintaining more control over it, aren't they, than if they put it out in a public space where perhaps an angry crowd at some point graffiti is on it or something, or perhaps if they undergo a damnatio, so some kind of political censure, maybe their name might be erased in a public space. But in some, do you think this is part of what's going on here, is that they have more control in their own house?
I think these persons that we presented, which were homeowners, of which we know the names, but also those we don't know the names, made donations and benefactions in the public sphere or in sanctuaries, and their names stood. So they could have been destroyed there.
Yeah, I think it makes more sense. Doesn't make any sense if they in my house. So they nearly could have done everything in the house. It's more secure. Or, so actually, I don't understand your argumentation, but maybe you're right. But I can prove it or anything. But I would think the other way around, as Elisabeth mentioned. It's much more vulnerable in the real public sphere, I would say. So in the house, you could have put your names. But what I would be interested in, what we haven't done until now, and we couldn't do this, or can't do this maybe also from the philological, from our point of education, it would be interesting to look through the texts, or also the, how do we call in English, the digest, the Digesten, for instance, yes. the legal corpora. If there's something in it, maybe you don't know more about it, or we have to look it through if there's anything about the houses. We didn't do this, for instance, text related to the house, apart from epigraphical random collection of literary texts. So it could be also very interesting and maybe enlightening.
Yes, it could be very interesting. Yes, yeah. And I don't know anything about that. So let's see. I see Vasilis has appeared. Perhaps that's a sign that we should bring our conversation to a close. But I want to thank you both very much for your contribution. This was really enlightening to me. So thank you.
Thank you very much for your response.
And I thank you all for this wonderful paper and the very interesting discussion. We are truly grateful. The next lecture in our series is going to take place on March 10th at the same time. The title is The Historical Frieze on the Arch of Constantine, and the speaker will be Sarah Bassett. Until then, be well, and we hope to see you in next month.